Stamping's a little bit easier in some ways. I say, look, it just goes up and down. We're putting holes, we're shaping the metal, and we're sending it on to the next
That is literally
phase.
the movement with my hands that I use when I describe stamping.
Well, so it tells you how old I am now when I go to Capitol Hill. I used to be able to refer to the movie Tommy Boy, where in Sandusky, Ohio, they're making brake pads going up and down. Now I'm too old because the 20-year-old staffers have not seen Tommy Boy.
Spring is right around the corner, which means it's time to dust off your clubs and get ready for Golfer Manufacturing South. This event is a fantastic opportunity to network with peers and contribute to NBT's manufacturing camp and scholarship programs. Enjoy a day of golf while supporting a great cause this April 15th at TPC Piper Glen in Charlotte, North Carolina. Save your spot today at fmamfg.org.
Hello, I'm Dan Davis. This is the Fabricator Podcast. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined today by my friend. Hello, Lincoln.
How you doing, man?
Good. This is Lincoln Bruner. Was that?
Friend.
Yes.
Yeah. My two enemies at the desk behind us. Brandon Geyer and Garrett Slager. No, they're friends as well. And you're my friend as well. Today's show, we have Omar Nashashibi of the Franklin Partnership. He's a lobbyist that represents plenty of companies in the metal fab, stamping, die cast, and forging community.
In Washington, D.C.
Correct. Yeah, where if you're going to lobby people about national politics, D.C. is a good place to be. And he's incredibly knowledgeable. So it's going to be a fast-paced episode, and the guy's a wealth of knowledge, and you'll see me struggle to keep up, but I think we did okay. You'll enjoy the conversation. So during the conversation, there's a reference made to Tommy Boy, which is probably not one you would think we would get to if you start to watch this interview. But
and it wasn't even made by one of us. Right. It was made by Omar.
So Omar is making the point of
the man in the suit,
trying to describe what stamping is to people who are maybe not familiar with the clientele he works with. And he made reference to like Tommy Boy, where they're using stamping presses to bang out brake pads. And for those that love trivia, it's Callahan Auto Parts, which Tommy's trying to save. And
Brian Dennehy.
Yeah, his point being is that he tries to make the reference to younger people, and they have no idea what he's talking about. They haven't seen the movie, which is both sad and a mission for us to make sure Tommy Boy is seen by a new generation.
That movie's like 30 years old now.
Well, you know what?
How long's Chris Farley been gone?
Yeah, right.
I don't know.
A long time.
So Chris Farley was not crushed in a stamping press, but they got us to talking about manufacturing in general. Not necessarily deaths on the shop floor, but manufacturing, metal fabricating in movies. Yeah. And what are some of the ones that pop out for you? Because honestly, I was kind of like thinking hard and nothing jumped out to me.
Mr. Mom. I mean, Michael Keaton's character is an automaker. So he works at a big automobile manufacturing plant in Detroit, gets laid off, and sets the stage for the entire movie. So, but they show him in, when I was a kid, I remember seeing it and thinking, oh, that's how cars are made. They still had robotic welders already in 1980 or whenever that movie was shot, 1982. So yeah, it was it got me thinking about that.
I don't think I've ever seen that.
Oh, Mr. Mom's a hilarious movie. Terry Garr. Yeah, it's
that'd be another one that people under 30 haven't seen.
No, they're true. I mean, if it comes up on Netflix, they might take a gander at it, but yeah.
No, Gareth, you had a more recent example?
Yeah, well, so when I started working for FMA in 2018, I never even noticed any sort of like manufacturing setting or metalworking settings in movies, but there was a Bob Odenkirk movie that came out in 2021 called Nobody, and he just plays like this unassuming government agent who has like a highly set of skills with his, he can kill you by like poking you, but he works in a front office at, I think, a metal fabrication shop, and there's some pretty gruesome scenes that take place.
And he has access to tools which might help him during a side gig.
Yes.
I recall that. Yeah, the only thing that jumped out to me was like Death Race, where they had to work on their cars to basically kill their rivals. So
and more recently, you've got Iron Man is always mentions his Bridgeport, which probably wouldn't be used by someone like Tony Stark. But yeah, it was interesting to hear a little manufacturing this and that throughout that whole Avengers
Welding
series.
product placement in Iron Man.
Yes.
If I remember correctly.
Yes.
Well, there's, on May 4th, Star Wars Day, we see posts with Princess Leia and Chewbacca welding together, various spaceships.
Yes.
So that leads me to like one of my favorite bits from the original Clerks, where the point is made, everybody tries to paint the Rebel Alliance as being the good guys, but yet how many contractors died on that Death Wish or Death Star?
That's
Death
right.
Wish.
Those contractors were not paid to shoot a gun because they
Exactly.
missed everyone.
They were caught in a crossfire, and that's not funny.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Well, and Josh Welton a few years ago wrote a review for a movie called Fatman.
Right.
We were talking about.
So yeah, that's Mel Gibson as Santa Claus.
Yeah, like a modern day blue collar Santa Claus.
Yeah. Well, just I guess Santa is blue collar, right? He's working hard.
Yeah.
Sure. Why not?
Yeah.
He's
overseeing a shop.
Yeah, it's a tough job,
he
man.
works graveyard shift.
Yeah, a lot of years. Santa looks like he has a lot of years on him in that movie.
A grizzled Hulk.
And once again, he finds tools in his workshop to help him defeat the bad guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
Can't go wrong.
Yeah, it was a kid who didn't get a present hired a hitman or something like that to kill the fat man.
Well, according to to Josh's write-up about it, it's a fabrication business that is a contractor for a Defense Department.
Well, kids.
Yeah.
Well, do we want me to spoil the plot line? Anyway,
Go ahead.
For Fatman?
no. Yeah, watch it during Christmas. Don't watch it now.
Right,
You want
right.
to watch it when it's cold.
I
can't tell you to restore your holiday spirit, but
or maybe watch it in July. Get you really going for December.
You can watch Mr. Mom anytime.
Yeah, there you go.
all right. On that note, please enjoy this episode with Omar Nashashibi of the Franklin Partnership, and it's going to be much more intelligent than this past 10 minutes. Thank you.
Peace out.
If you're involved in the pipe and tube industry, you won't want to miss the Pipe and Tube Conference this May in Omaha, Nebraska. This event is an excellent opportunity to connect with industry experts, stay up to date with the latest technologies, and explore new business opportunities. You'll leave the conference with a wealth of knowledge and new connections to help your business succeed. So mark your calendar and join us in Omaha for the Pipe and Tube Conference. Register today at fmamfg.org. And now, back to the episode.
Hello. Welcome back to the Fabricator Podcast. Today's guest, Omar Nashashibi. Omar is a lobbyist. Is that the right title we should be using?
Yes, you can call me that, although I've been called better and worse, actually.
An experienced voice in Washington. He's spoken several times at not only events like our FMA annual meeting, but other places. And Omar, before we get started, maybe tell the audience a little bit about yourself and the folks you work with.
Absolutely. Appreciate you having me here today. So I founded my firm back in 2005, having previously worked with a number of lawyers. After you've worked with a couple hundred lawyers, after a couple of years, that's probably about enough of it. And I can make lawyer jokes, I'm married to one. So having started a lobbying firm in 2005, we have a long history working with manufacturers. We first began working for a trade association as their lobbyist in 2002, going back to the steel tariffs that George W. Bush put in place during that era. And since then, we've started working for a number of different manufacturing trade associations, largely tier 1, but mostly tier 2, tier 3, downstream suppliers to different industries out there. Everything from stampers, tool and die makers, die casters, forgers, screw machine shops, valve manufacturers, mold makers. So quite a bit. They're the backbone of American industry, and on a whole host of issues. You can imagine when you're in manufacturing, everything from EPA to OSHA to taxes to trade. So there's no shortage of topics that I lobby on, and my job is to be their voice in Washington and also their eyes and ears to help them understand what comes out of that town that affects their business.
Yeah, and our industry dominated by small to medium-sized businesses, and they really lean on firms like yourself to have at least a voice where they think they can be heard. I imagine that's pretty difficult in Washington.
That is absolutely right. Over the years, you especially have the larger corporations. They all have their own offices. The multinationals or the publicly traded, they have offices on K Street or somewhere near Capitol Hill. But it's the voices of the small businesses that really politicians want to hear from, because that's the backbone of the economy, of industry, and that's the vast majority of employers, frankly, in the country, particularly when it comes to manufacturing. So together, they pack a much stronger political punch than often they realize.
Yeah. Lately, Omar, what are some of the things that those businesses are telling you that they really need representation for?
Absolutely. So we always hear about workforce. Workforce, number one topic whenever I speak to individuals. I think back to the Great Recession, business owners, they didn't let go of their master tool makers or their skilled tradespeople. They stopped taking a paycheck themselves. So they understand. And even right now, we're maybe seeing a slight slowdown in some of the hiring that we had seen over the last couple of years. Right. But still, if somebody comes across a skilled individual, they'll still hire them and find a way to put them to work. And that still ranks usually one of my top issues in the surveys for my manufacturers. Other ones certainly on taxes, the uncertainty over the last couple of years, and I know we'll get more into that here as we go on, and hopefully there'll be more certainty coming out of Congress. But sometimes you'll notice that inaction from Washington can hurt you more than action, and that's something that we've seen here on taxes as well.
Yeah. We're at a state in U.S. politics where, I mean, for lack of a better phrase, it's disorganized. But when it comes to unifying behind manufacturing, that seems to be a bipartisan issue. Is that an accurate take?
Oh, absolutely. If you look back at the number of bills that were introduced when I first started working for manufacturers in 2002, that we had maybe a couple hundred introduced every year. Now we had over 1,400 bills introduced last year in 2023 alone mentioning manufacturing. Now, some might say good or bad,
right?
But there is a focus on manufacturing right now in a way that we just have not seen in the past. And absolutely, they see that.
Yeah.
How did that awareness arise, do you think, having worked in the city so long? I mean, culturally among lawmakers, what led to that awareness?
Well, we've seen as an art. If you look at it, if you've been in manufacturing and you are a recruiter, you've seen the difficulty after China entered the WTO and sort of the rise after the late 90s into the 2000s. And then we had the Great Recession. A lot of folks didn't want to necessarily send their kids into manufacturing. But now at the same time, they're starting to recognize that a 4-year degree isn't for everybody. Right. And with that, we're starting to also recognize the importance that manufacturing has. I don't say we have jobs available. You have careers available, because these are family-sustaining careers that are being offered. You can make 6-figure salary in your 20s in South Bend, Indiana. Yeah. That's a real foundation. You cannot really earn it in another industry, in retail or other areas in a warehouse. Right. And that's something that we've certainly seen. And then, of course, the pandemic. The reliance on what manufacturing meant during that to the average American, when we're seeing shortages and the over-reliance on overseas, the politicians really took note of that as well. Right. So right now, I work overall for 3,200 manufacturers, small, medium-sized businesses between all of my trade associations. They want to hear from every single one of them. I mean, this is what you call right now a political goldmine for a politician if they have manufacturers in their district.
Wow. Workforce development legislation, is that a case of too much happening? And what I'm getting at is that there's a lot of resources. It's just a matter of where you look to find them. And sometimes I think organization underneath the umbrella of the federal government is just vast.
It is. And workforce is such a local issue. Right. Whether you're recruiting locally or you're trying to understand where the dollars are coming from, we assist companies identifying grants, and many of them do come out of a purse from Washington, but typically they're distributed either through the state or coming down in through the county, state administrative agencies. And getting that local connection is really important to understanding where the dollars are, because as you said, if you're trying to go to Washington and bring some dollars back to your small business, to your community, it's often very difficult because they're going to want to send it to a larger entity, and by that factor, you're going to be pushed out of the way. So really just going and digging down and say what is available locally. And manufacturers often don't realize that there's money for activities they're already doing. Hiring a veteran, work opportunity tax credit. Hiring somebody on long-term unemployed, work opportunity tax credit. You're engaging in apprenticeship. There's probably a tax credit for that as well. There's tuition training assistance. All those different at the state level are available in addition to some of the offerings that the federal government provides. But your point is absolutely correct. Sometimes you don't know where to start, especially if you're a small business.
Having somebody to point you in that direction would be helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so what are some resources online or elsewhere that people can readily avail themselves of to learn about these things?
A number of ways. The most simplest way at the federal level is going to grants.gov. But again, you often, for a for-profit business, there's not as many opportunities. But if you have what we call a hub and spoke system created in your community, we have a community college or a high school to be that center. And then you have different employer organizations, employee representative groups, student-led groups as well. And that way you can start seeing how the money can come down. There was a community college grant that came out a few years ago. tens of millions of dollars, but they were only going to community colleges that had a hub and spoke system, meaning there was a business stakeholder involved. They're not just sending dollars out into the colleges and the schools like they used to. They're really getting a lot more focus. So one of the ways that we suggest, in addition to the federal dollars, is look up your local workforce investment board. Sometimes they're called a workforce development board.
Right.
Almost every state will have them. If you're large enough, your local MSA or county will as well. And you can start to identify some of the grant dollars that are available. And your trade association is always a good way as well. And I'm strongly encouraging, obviously not just as a representative of trade associations, but I've seen how small businesses can use those resources available among their peers, their networking, and what staff can provide.
Yeah. You mentioned tax policy being important to your members, and obviously as small to medium-sized companies in our fabricating world, that it really resonates with them as well. Is the unpredictable nature of tax policy creation kind of added just an element of angst? Sometimes it's better to know the devil you know rather than the devil that may come.
Well, absolutely. Stability is all manufacturers crave because many of them that I work with are looking at their 1, 3, 5-year, and many of them are their 10-year plans. If you're a next generation manufacturer, you're asking me questions about where is this product line going to be in 2035? What is the EU doing in terms of some of the regulations on the chemicals that are permitted in the products? And you have to work your way backwards, knowing if you're not just stability, what are some variables and inputs I can put into my factors to see what comes out? And that instability has been very problematic in taxes. I'll give you a few examples. My manufacturers in my tool and die industry and for my machine shops and my stampers, we do an annual survey. 35% of them reduced their research and development activity last year as a direct result of not being able to fully expense your R&D activities and having to amortize your R&D over 5 years. That's a direct result of congressional inaction because the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act started that on January 1st of 2022, you no longer could fully expense R&D. So that's 35% reduced it. In addition, because you couldn't fully expense at 100% your CapEx in 2023, 41% of our manufacturers reduced their CapEx spending last year as a direct result of, again, congressional inaction on tax policy. That's real money that's not going into the American economy because you think of your purchasing power. If you're purchasing a $10 million stamping press and now it's at 60% instead of 100% write-off, that you're not buying it anymore. Your bank is looking at you a lot differently in terms of the financing, and you're having to make real hard decisions because of congressional inaction again.
Yeah, and juxtapose that against rising interest rates, and maybe you're not seeing that kind of shot into the industry you might otherwise see with some investment.
Yeah. One other area in tax policy, and your look right now as we're recording this and where Congress is in the tax policy discussion, we're coming up on a major fiscal cliff in 2025. At December 31st, 2025, many of these individual tax breaks that were put in place in 2017 go away or completely phase out. We're looking at another drop in the 100% expensing over the couple of years. Your 199A, which for you pass-throughs, which was over half of my manufacturers, your personal income rate now goes back up to 39.6 from your current rate. All of that goes away. There's a fiscal cliff coming, and that uncertainty over what Congress will do will depend on who's president, who's control of Congress, and if they actually meet deadlines of getting this done by December 31st of 2025.
Wow. I didn't realize that. That'll get some attention.
There's a lot of money on the table coming up. And how do you, if you're putting equipment into service, sometimes it can take 18 months.
Yeah.
And 18 months right now, as we're recording, is past that fiscal cliff that's coming at the end of next year.
Do you feel most of your members that you represent are knowledgeable about this impending date?
Well, hopefully. I'm giving 40 speeches on the road this year to different manufacturing groups. So by the time I'm done, you can tell me what you think. But that's my mission. Is I really try to work with companies to put in how government will impact them.
Right.
Because whether you like it or not, they are your not-so-silent partner. And working your way backwards from those milestones that are going to affect your business, you can't be caught by surprise.
Yeah. In your experience in Washington, have you seen the town kind of at this state in terms of their inability to they come together on some things, but there's a lot of drama. Is it unparalleled or?
It keeps getting worse. I hate to say it. I permanently moved to Washington in 1998, which puts me on my 5th administration, I think it is. And so obviously I've seen the situation deteriorate. There were still times when you had George W. Bush that was working with Ted Kennedy on education legislation. That doesn't seem like something like that would happen these days. Right. We saw what Pelosi was even able to do in bipartisan manners over the time. But the problem is you increasingly, to inject politics of it, It's a primary-driven election, and by that meaning most of the results that you see on Capitol Hill are result of not a general election with people voting in November.
Right.
This year we're expecting maybe 25 to 40 seats out of 435 to be competitive.
Wow.
The rest of them are going to be all Republican or all Democrat. The ones in the middle, those are the ones that decide who controls the House or the Senate, but ultimately the rest of the body is determined in the primaries in April, in May, in March of right now. And that's when you have that, there's no incentive to gravitate towards the center because you're not competing against the other party. You're competing against your left flank or your right flank. And that has made policymaking much more difficult. We'll give you an example of where we are right now. Republicans may be in control of the U.S. House of Representatives, but every major bill that's passed right now so far in this Congress has done so with more Democrats voting yes than Republicans. Yet they're still in control. And that shows you the difficulty. And that's not necessarily bipartisanship.
Right.
That means that the Republicans themselves aren't even fully aligned in what they can get through the U.S. House.
Yeah. It's, trying to explain to my son how the structure of the government is set up to where people are supposed to work within their party system. And it's when it doesn't work, it just makes harder for other things to work. Yeah.
How does that kind of acrimony play on you as a lobbyist, as someone who's working day in and day out with these folks?
Well, first I tell my 12-year-old to get a real job and not do what I do. His father is a grandfather is a civil engineer. His grandparents, both doctors. So don't do what I do. I talk for a living. But it's difficult because people immediately just knee-jerk reaction, hate Washington. Don't want to discuss politics. I gave a speech in Texas last week, and an individual came up to me afterwards and says, I was really dreading this. I did not want to come to see you speak. But I learned a lot. I'm really glad I did. You made me think about things in a different way that I wouldn't have before you came here. And that's helpful. The more that I can demonstrate to them that there's a value in news that you can use for your business. Yeah. Because if it's coming from me from Washington, then they can see that as a reliable source. And one thing where I've noticed whether it's mainstream media or whatever you all choose to get your news from, you won't trust it as much as you will from somebody that does this for a living. Right. That often you're paying me to do it. Right. But at the same sense, I don't have my own personal gains. I'm not running for office. My job is to make sure you're the best informed to be able to keep manufacturing and doing what you are doing.
Right. Yeah.
So material always is a big concern for our population in the metal fabricating industry. Do you see where we are now as kind of being what be the case in the near future? It seems like with the tariffs being assigned only to what I would call non-ally partners. Can you go into that a little bit?
Well, there's obviously the uncertainty of former President Trump coming back in. He's clearly said that he wants to put a 10% tariff across the board on all products, friend, foe, ally, in between, and then potentially a 60% tariff rate at minimum on China. Let me come back to some of the China policy maybe in a little bit and setting that aside. But from the material standpoint, I believe tariffs are here to stay for the remainder of the decade and potentially even beyond. Wow. The question is, how do you look at it? Who's an ally? And in terms of trade policy, or is it national security policy? Some look at it as both. But in the case of Mexico, for example, many would view as there's no closer economic ally to the United States. Right. But the U.S. trade representative right now is in discussions with her Mexican counterpart because we're seeing a surge in imports coming in from Mexico. At the same time, we're seeing a surge from China going into Mexico. So is this transshipment?
Right.
The U.S. is saying in talks with her counterpart that we could reimpose a Section 232 tariffs on Mexico that have been technically suspended. They're not eliminated, but suspended since 2019. Inversely, Mexico has said if you do that, we will now reinstate tariffs on steel coming out of the U.S. There's not much of it, but enough. And so you can see that there's still a lingering threat of tariffs on both sides. And the U.S. and the EU are not even far behind. The tariff rate quota system that was extended for another year by the Biden administration goes to the end of 2025. But the European Union only suspended their retaliatory tariffs to March of 2025. The reason that's important is the EU is hedging that Trump might win. Right. Which means they are seeing there's a potential for tariff to come back into place. $6 billion are currently suspended to March of 25 on U.S. exports going into Europe. So the supply chains are still vulnerable to tariffs because of the political outcomes. And we're seeing that type of protectionism across the globe. And I'd love to get more in depth on the types of tariffs because I think you are going to see increasingly carbon-based tariffs being the next step. Right. But right now, if I'm a materials buyer, I am expecting some type of government tariff rate and taxes, U.S., EU, and some other key players, at least through 28, but likely through the rest of the decade.
Yeah. Is there concern about, particularly from a place like China, where there are tariffs in place, but shipping the materials to like another country, Vietnam, and then shipping fabrications into North America. Is that on the radar of Capitol Hill and maybe some of the policymakers there?
Oh, absolutely. We call that transshipment in
that
the
was the
trade
phrase
world.
then.
Yes.
Yeah.
And right now we've noticed that quite a bit, especially when we saw the way the new NAFTA was negotiated, the USMCA, the benefit of being in Mexico, there was no question. And when you couple that with the 25% tariff on Chinese inputs and imports coming into the United States, it's clearly you're going to squeeze that bubble in trade terms and it's going to migrate somewhere else. We just don't have that domestic capacity or even the price ability to ramp it up in the U.S. I discussed with my forgers, for example, they'll tell me the landed price of a Chinese forging is 40 to 70% cheaper.
Wow.
Landed coming in from China. And so it's worth the water time. It's worth the 30 to 45 it's going to take to get here because 40, 70%, you can't compete with that. But yes, the transshipment is Vietnam for sure. We're seeing increasingly through Philippines is another country over there as well. There's going to be a cluster in Southeast Asia. What we're expecting from China is increasingly less finished goods coming out there, but more sophisticated components being exported and then assembled elsewhere in the world for final importation in the United States. If you look at the numbers coming in from the Financial Times, this a couple of weeks ago, you'll look at almost a month ago now in February, mid-February, did a great spread on importations from Mexico, and at the same time, the correlation of from China into Mexico, the trucks coming across the ports, the increasing numbers. So U.S. government is very much focused on transshipments. I know my manufacturers are, and we're looking at that very closely.
Well, I know that Mexico now represents the largest trading partner with the U.S., surpassing China. So it's almost reflective in what you're describing.
Well, and if you look at where right now, whether it's BYD, the EV company for China, that's looking at facilities across the border. Usually we look at that 25 kilometers within the U.S. border on the Mexican side, or other companies too. Mexico is certainly an attractive input because they have roughly 50 trade agreements with different regions and countries. And so you're going to see that not only as an import base into the United States, but an export opportunity to the rest of the world. It's difficult for a lot of U.S. companies right now.
I know it's very attractive for Mexico, for one, but now you've got to interject that with the whole nearshoring surge, very popular term now. I mean, how do you see that playing out with all of this in the mix?
Nearshoring has been very helpful to a lot of my manufacturers. Onshoring, reshoring, all of those. We've certainly seen that post-pandemic quite a bit. And we've even seen a dual folks where they're trying to buy multiple of the same product just in case as a backup. They'll buy one from the U.S. and buy the same die from China just to have it. I've seen a number of those right now. But generally, I do see that there's going to be some challenges moving forward in this space. You would look at whether or not it's coming from China. I think that a lot of it's going into Europe, but then ultimately Canada and Mexico are major trading partners with lower tariff rates. If you come through under the new USMCA, the new NAFTA, then you still can't compete in a lot of cases with the U.S. And if you're looking at a multinational that's looking to relocate, are they going to pick somewhere that's, let's say, above in a blue state versus a red state in the U.S. or in Mexico? It's still cheaper down in Mexico. Right. Even as they increase the rate to $16 an hour there, so compared to $27, $30 an hour here in the U.S., and all you have to do is bring it across the border.
Yeah. Right. OSHA? I mean, it seems like obviously depending on who's in the White House, it influences just how aggressive may not be the right word, but how active they are. Do you see a continuation of that given the current administration?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And what we always see with any administration in the year of their election or re-election, or even the end of their term, they tend to rush to try to get a number of their rules and regulations through in the chance that their party or they themselves are defeated in November. And we are certainly seeing a rush to act right now at OSHA. One of the top priorities that my manufacturers are currently looking at, one deals with the OSHA heat rule. Last year in 2023, they began developing an indoor and outdoor heat rule by which when the heat index exceeded 80 degrees Fahrenheit, you'd have different requirements on an employer, both indoor and outdoor, meaning they would initially treat a restaurant, an outdoor construction worker, agriculture, and manufacturer all in similar fashion. Once the heat index under this proposal that was released in October exceeds 80 degrees Fahrenheit, you might be required to have a rest break every 2 hours of 10 minutes. If it exceeds 87 degrees, you have to do a 15-minute rest break. It'd be required to also have a certain amount of cold water administered and permissible to the employee. One proposal also said and would mandate that they'd have access to water at their workstation. Now, I work for die casters. There's molten metal. You do not want a drop of water anywhere near molten metal. It will literally implode the facility. Let's talk about OSHA violations. And that's really one of the things where one size fits all just does not work. I'm working right now on a labor department apprenticeship rule. We're not the same as electricians and plumbers. There's dozens of apprenticeable occupations. And if OSHA were to move forward on this heat rule, they're talking about everything from weather acclimatization, having onboarding new employees that would work reduction of their shift, only 50% for day one, ramp them up. Another proposal had them only working a third of their work shift for week one, then 2/3 week two. And the response from OSHA was put them somewhere else and find something else for them to do. Exactly. There's some real challenges in some of the rulemaking that's coming out. OSHA is currently in the process of analyzing a number of the comments. There was a Small Business Administration review of the impact on those smaller entities. I had a number of my manufacturers participate in that process, and we may see some action. We've already seen California, their indoor heat rule, similar line as this, will go into effect ahead of this summer as well. Oh, wow. We've got Minnesota already has one on the books, as does Washington State, Oregon as well. And we can continue to see this spread even at some states, even if we don't get a rule coming out of OSHA at the federal level.
Do you have any forging companies on the West Coast? Do such things exist, I guess?
They do. I've got die casters. I've got forgers out on the West Coast. There's a number of them. And there's facilities. Some of them are close, but you cannot redo. It's not feasible to reduce the temperature. We're molten metal at 2,000 degrees, some higher, depends on what they're doing. Right. And it's not safe. The type of PPE that the OSHA would consider, these folks, especially if you're near the molten metal, they've got face coverings, hand coverings, head to toe, certain kind of shoe guards as well. And some of those increase the heat on a person's individual. And when we're talking tracking the heat, it's not in your quality control station or in your break room or even just outdoors. It's at the workstation as well. Right. Oh, yeah. So the temperature monitoring from the supervisor, they'd have to go around or set up an automated system and then go do wellness checks on the employees as well.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask, is ignorance at the official level something that manufacturers run into often, where you're having to actually do an education seminar for the people that you're lobbying?
Oh, absolutely. And some of it's not really necessarily their fault. You have to understand that we all come from different backgrounds.
Sure, of course.
You might have in a previous life been an attorney or a real estate agent or an insurance broker, and now you find yourself on Capitol Hill talking about tax policy or technology or healthcare and some of the most complicated defense platforms in the world. And this is all gibberish to you. You have to catch up and learn. And similar, when I'm dealing with OSHA, many of them simply don't understand the processes. Right. And it can also depend on the OSHA inspector that may come into your shop. Sure. Right now on the health or in the heat, for example, since April 8th of 2022, you have been required under the National Emphasis Program to have a section of your manual that addresses heat in your facility. You have to have training. You have to have some kind of way to address what is your response if there is a heat-related incident in your shop. That's been on the books since April of 2022, and those continue to expand. But again, that's a one-size-fits-all. What they're trying to apply to the outdoor agriculture worker or into the kitchen of a restaurant. These are very valid concerns, but when we're sitting in a manufacturing facility that depends on molten metal and heat, one size is not going to fit all.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
When we have to explain what metal fabricating is to people, it's just a little bit more complicated when you get into die casting and forging.
It is. Stamping's a little bit easier in some ways. I say, look, it just goes up and down. We're putting holes, we're shaping the metal, and we're sending it on to the next
That is literally
phase.
the movement with my hands that I use when I describe stamping.
Well, so it tells you how old I am now when I go to Capitol Hill. I used to be able to refer to the movie Tommy Boy, where in Sandusky, Ohio, they're making brake pads going up and down. Now I'm too old because the 20-year-old staffers have not seen Tommy Boy. So that tells you how old I'm.
Okay, movie night at my place. Just get you all up to speed.
So before we wrap up, EPA actions, anything interesting happening there?
EPA is one that I always caution folks that, yes, you're going to have a lot of political influence on what a rule comes out, but the politics will not dictate whether or not a rule, in fact, does emerge, because lawsuits will typically drive that. And those lawsuits will come from different organizations. They're going to come from community groups, environmental activists, community wellness as well. And when that happens, they will typically go to the courts to force the EPA to take action. And that's how you typically get a number of the major rules that emerge out, whether it came out of W. Bush administration or even under Trump. And Trump put out the American Clean Energy, the ACE, and then we saw Biden come in and reverse that. If Trump comes in, he'll obviously reverse a number of the climate-oriented EPA initiatives that the current administration's put forward, but it's always the lawsuits that tend to drive an action, and then the question is how much. But yes, one that we're definitely taking a look at right now is the particulate matter 2.5, is referred to PM 2.5. That comes down to 2.5 micrograms, 70 is a human hair, so you can understand how small these particles are that can potentially go into the lungs. The US EPA is proposing to lower the standard from 12 micrograms cubic units down to 9 and phase that in. And what that means to the average manufacturer. I spoke with a company from Illinois a few weeks ago that was in Washington. His state EPA is not permitting him to move forward on an expansion project because they will expand and put them in a further non-attainment status with the EPA due to the potential emissions that it would put forward. And that shows you how real-life lowering emissions for Washington. Now, the state saying these are not my standards, we have to comply with what comes out of Washington through our state implementation plan through the SIP. And that means that manufacturer is basically on hold on their permitting. Similar, if this EPA PM 2.5 rule goes through, that will make it more difficult over time for some of these communities to get into attainment with added manufacturing activity. So on one hand, you have the government incentivizing additional manufacturing activities, Biden touting all this, and then on the other hand, you have OSHA and EPA in some cases making it a little bit more complicated to do business in the country.
Yeah. Do you see the current administration, whether later this year or going into if they are reelected, slowing down on their goals to get to electrification for like the automobile industry? It seems like the market's kind of voted with their dollars a little bit. Subsidies not there anymore. I think we'll end up there, but it didn't seem it's going to be on that contracted path that was originally set.
Correct. And there's a number of factors there. They did make it easier for not the dealers themselves, but for the purchasers of new autos to get the $7,500 just by going through the dealers. Now, some of those auto dealers themselves are having challenges recouping that. Sure. And part of it has been market conditions. The challenge, if you start building up the U.S. infrastructure so quickly, whereas now you're not going to have enough of the consumer product out on the road, you might potentially see $11,000 cars coming in from Mexico that have labels of BYD coming in from China. Yeah. And that is an increasing concern because the Chinese EV market is already there. They have an excess of product. They're looking for somewhere to put it. And the Biden administration is also calculating, one, where is the U.S. consumer? Where is the potential infrastructure with range anxiety? And then are we really creating an infrastructure for a Chinese EV company that's already ready, already has the mass product at a much lower rate where the consumer might be willing to take that risk and then push out the U.S. market and U.S. manufacturer and the OEMs. And so will the Biden administration slow down? No, I don't think they will slow down. I think they've got a number of factors that they're putting in. Keep in mind, they're looking at nuclear, small modular reactors. That's a priority for them. Hydro, geothermal's on there. Obviously, offshore, onshore, and solar make up the 5 points that they're going to continue to push forward.
Yeah. Who are the parties pushing for that type of advancement in energy development in the U.S.? Is it large corporations, tech companies that consume so much energy?
It is large corporations, but there's also a number of administrative applications for hydro technology, for example. Industry, they're looking at that as an option. You're going to see a lot of the semi-trucks where we understand using some form of hydro for their fuel is cheaper and more efficient than EV, for example, for a larger semi and a rig. And I've also had inquiries from some of my manufacturers that are looking at hydro and other options. Solar panels, some of my manufacturers have been putting those on and telling me because you're getting not only from the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, then you're also able to receive some tax incentives, depends on the state in which you live. So there are still a lot of, CHIPS Act, for example, that's largely fabs, larger corporations working on that. But the other IRA, I've seen a good maybe 1 in 5 of my companies taking advantage of some kind of tax credits that are available through the Inflation Reduction Act for some kind of energy incentives that are out there.
They're going to do something to keep their trucks on the road. Yeah. I mean, they have to. Right. There's no, from your perspective, what are some things that manufacturers can be doing to ensure, should we say, profitability with regulations and everything? I mean, I'm just curious about what are some things that you're touting as, hey, make sure you're keeping an eye on this to maintain your profitability and viability.
I'm a big believer in working my way backwards. And what do I know in terms of solid dates that will affect my business? If I'm looking to expand my company, if I'm looking to enter into a new market, I want to identify what tax incentive or what government policy has to phase out or phase in for it to be more profitable. For example, if I'm looking to do a major construction facility that I'm going to incorporate energy savings, I need to start thinking that many of these start to phase out in 2029 and are gone in 2032. When I overlay that with my 100% bonus depreciation potentially being completely zeroed out in 2027, well, now I've got the shell that had to be done by 29, but what I put in the shell had to be placed in service by 27. We're already in 2024, end of first quarter here, just about in a couple of weeks. And where does that put you? You got to start planning now. And when I talk to my manufacturers, you have to work with what you do know. Use those variables as an input into your calculation to try to look at that profitability. If I'm a plastics manufacturer, I want to be watching the European Union as they try to factor and move out plastics in toys, for example. That's a dying industry. You have to start looking at what different solvents am I using that the EPA is potentially eliminating, that the EU, it's on the PFAS forever chemical list that I want to get rid of, and get a better sense of, am I over investing in a product or a process that may be either outlawed or be phased out by my customer or by the country that regulates that customer. And that's something that I always try to have them watch out for. Again, whether you like it or not, governments are your not so silent partner.
Yeah, it moves fast. You don't get this in the morning paper on the front page. There's a lot of things to keep track of.
Drink from a fire hose is what most folks tell me after I give a speech.
Yeah. Has the pace of change picked up?
It has. I think it's a lot more because folks have realized what an impact government does have on them. Post-pandemic, no question. During the pandemic, we were doing webinars on a weekly basis, fielding calls from manufacturers on an hourly basis. What does this county in Pennsylvania mean? Can you get us in touch with my state legislature? Can you help me out with my county commissioner? Help us keep the doors open. We're making medical devices. So I think it really opened the eyes to, you can really use government to your advantage if you know how. If you completely ignore it, they're not going to knock on the door so silently. And we've got even one small manufacturer in Indiana. He got $3 million in between state and federal grants over the last several years, just for doing things he was going to do anyway, because he decided to look. And so I encourage everybody, there's the good and the bad of government. They try to take advantage of it, and it's your money. Try to bring it home as much as you can.
Yeah, no, we've sat through enough presentations this week here at the FMA annual meeting where if you just have someone able to dedicate a little bit of time to investigate some of these opportunities, it means a big difference.
That's the real challenge. Find a quarter of an FTE, folks. That's what you need. You need somebody that's going to be able, once you build your system, have them understand, what does this impact me? How does this go through your trade association, look at their newsletters, figure out what's going on that impacts your business, what opportunities may be out there, and also help you understand markets. Your sales team needs to be brought into this. Your HR team need to be part of this. Your CFO needs to be part of these conversations because these incentives could point you in the direction of the health of my customers, the health of my business, and you need to be watching those trends.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time, Omar. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all for having me.
Can they find out more about your firm on the web?
Absolutely. TheFranklinPartnership.com. We're a nonpartisan, bipartisan lobbying firm based in Washington, D.C., and we're always happy to help. Anything we can do, we're a small business. Anything we can do to help manufacturing in America, we're always pleased to do so. Yeah,
and if you have the chance to catch Omar speak, the many engagements that he has, but a lot of them with industry associations like FMA, he's typically there. So let us know if you have any comments, criticisms, complaints. You can send those to podcast at fmamfg.org. Once again, thanks a lot, and be sure and tell your friends about the Fabricator Podcast. Bye.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you.
The Fabricator Podcast is a production of Fabricators and Manufacturers Association, located in Elgin, Illinois. The show is hosted by Dan Davis and the staff of FMA Communications. The podcast is produced by Gareth Slager and recorded and edited with the help of Brandon Geyer. Sales support provided by Andy Flando. Additional production support by Elizabeth Gavin, Dana Weicker, Mary Diamond, Mike Owens, and me, Sarah Spring. Thank you for listening.